Thank you very much for coming. My name's Mel Dodd. I'm the Programme Director of Spatial Practice. We're the hosts of this evening's debate. And for those who've been before, you know the score. But this is part of our regular evening lecture series, and we've been running this for about 3 years. We open mainly to staff and students, but we're also, we have about, I think, 150 or more guests here tonight, so this is a very popular evening, and so welcome. Make sure you warm up your questions. It's a debate, which means that after the panel have spoken, you need to get involved. We need to sort of warm things up a bit, so please get ready with comments, questions. I'm also going to just hand over really now to Oliver Wainwright. He's our host for the night. Before I do that, I just want to give a plug for the series in general, which is up on the screen. We've had 3 debates. This is the middle one. We've got one more in a fortnight, and the whole series is closed off with a symposium, which is running on the 2nd and 3rd of March, and tickets are now on sale. That's also a fantastic sort of summary, I think, of the whole series, and we've got amazing speakers from internationally. We've got Who Builds Your Architecture, the Architecture Lobby, Precarious Workers Brigade, Concrete Action, and so on. So just go and have a look at the links that you might see on social media and consider coming to that as well. All right, so I'll hand over to Ollie and he can tell us about the evening's entertainment.
Great. Well, thank you, Mel. I'll do my best to make it as entertaining as possible. I'm glad you all got to witness this kind of demonstration of work as you arrived. That was all part of the plan to see this kind of active architectural labour of the stage being set up. So as Mel said, this is the second in a series titled The Way We Work. Last year, the Fundamentals debate series looked at issues outside the world of architecture, the kinds of invisible forces that architects often don't think about tackling, whether it's the planning system or the land market, the kind of forces which shape the city outside the profession. This year's series is trying to do precisely the opposite, focusing a spotlight on architecture as a discipline, as a practice, and as a kind of business, often the sides of architectural practice that we're not really taught in architecture school. So 2 weeks ago we began with Learn, looking at the current kind of crisis of architectural education and 4 alternative routes to how it, sharing some suggestions to how it might be solved. This week we're looking at the kind of working culture of architecture, which is a topic, I suppose, particularly close to my heart because it's one of the reasons that I left the profession. On one of my own years out, I worked for a Pritzker Prize-winning architect in Rotterdam who shall not be named, where as an intern, the standard working hours were 7 days a week, 10 a.m. till midnight. Often competition meetings were scheduled for 1 or 2 a.m. and that was kind of standard. And for this amazing chance to work in this office, I was rewarded with the princely sum of €400 a month. So not quite an unpaid internship, but pretty close. And I'm not alone. I mean, a recent poll in the Architects Journal found that 40% of architects report working more than 10 hours of overtime a week, 84% of which said they were never paid for working that extra overtime. 15% of all architects in the UK are working in excess of 50 hours a week, which is actually in breach of the work time regulations. So your practice is breaking the law by asking you to work that many hours. 38% of all practicing architects in the UK, sorry to bombard you with statistics, but 38% fear that this extra workload is damaging their mental health. So, I mean, there are various symptoms of this kind of masochistic working culture which we've developed, not least the appearance of a fleeting appearance of a website called ArchLeaks or ArchiLeaks in 2012, which was a kind of whistleblowing website based on WikiLeaks, very quickly shut down by the practices whose working culture was exposed on that site, I should hasten to add. Again, the Architects Journal survey showed that the average salary of a Part 1 and Part 2 student in the UK is less than £20,000. So you're studying for 5-7 years and being rewarded with that kind of salary. The gender pay gap still persists. The average female architect in the UK is on 35,000. Her male counterpart in exactly the same position is on 37,500. Again, these statistics come from the same AJ survey. So we're in this situation and we've got no actual union to represent our rights. You know, a lot of us are kind of precariously employed on short-term contracts. I myself am a fixed freelancer, you know, no holiday pay, no national insurance, no pension, you know, which many architects are on the same kind of contract. So, you know, for a profession that's ultimately concerned with making the world a better place, we don't seem to be very interested in our own working conditions. So there are a few little provocations. With me to discuss these issues and hopefully provoke some more, I've got 4 speakers from the world of architecture, from different kinds of practices, from academia, research and campaigning outside the profession. We're going to kick off, well, after a little brief surprise, but we're going to kick off with Peter Morris, who's a co-founder of Allford Hall Monaghan Morris. Then we're going to hear from Lucy Carmichael, who's the director of practice at the RIBA. Following her, we'll hear from Patrik Schumacher, who's the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects. And finally, Joe Carr is heroically standing in for Harriet Harris, architectural historian, teacher and writer, and was long-time director of critical and historical studies at the Royal College of Art. But before that, we're going to have a 5-minute presentation in video form. This week is a bit more multimedia than usual, from architectural workers. And the reason they're presenting in video form is that they're an anonymous, independent network of people who work in and around the architecture industry. They campaign against the negative effects of architectural work on physical bodies and mental health, as well as the wider social and physical environment. They formed in December 2016 and campaign on the issues affecting workers within the industry, from unpaid overtime, the London living wage, and the moral evaluation of the tasks that we are employed to carry out.
The cornerstone of architectural practice is a division of the people involved into a small minority of architectural businessmen and bureaucrats, the management, partner, chief architecture, etc. on one hand, and architectural workers, be they architects, architectural assistants, technicians, draftsmen, secretaries, etc. on the other hand. We are concerned with the people who by and large do the work of architecture, designing, drawing, specifying materials, supervising work on site, and those who provide them with essential clerical and administrative support. These are the architectural workers. Now, you're made to feel like there are 200 people who will take your job instantly and do it better than you do for free. You're made to feel dispensable, and the work that you are doing is dispensable work. It's not particularly fulfilling. Because I didn't want to lose my job. I knew it wasn't right, but I ended up doing it until I left. I was given a 6-month contract, and I think I was lucky to make it to the end of that. The thing about everyone undercuts everyone. If we don't have a tiny bit worth getting the job when we can't actually afford to do the work. It's not very sustainable, and I don't think it will become sustainable until architects make a stand and say everyone is leaving the profession because no one can afford to live and be a recently qualified architect. You're leaving the office on time or before 7 o'clock, everyone's like, how on earth are they leaving early, even though we're only paid from 9 till 5. You're asked to work weekends unpaid. If you have plans already, you have to drop your plans, you don't get the option, you're kind of bullied into it. I worked it out once. Before overtime, if I worked my base contractual hours, which was 37.5 hours per week, then it would be £11 per hour, but on a normal week, I would be working 12 to 16 hours unpaid overtime. And then some weeks would be about 24 hours, and if I was on competition, and on competitions it would be between 30 to 40 hours unpaid overtime. Meetings in the studio with clients, and the boss got incredibly stressed far too easily. We would all be doing the drawings and prep, and she would come in and cause havoc and start shouting. Whenever she was in the room, it felt intense and uncomfortable. Able to openly critique the work that we do in practice. I know someone who reported something to HR and they're not colleagues of mine anymore. I was earning 19 grand a decade ago as a Part 1, and I know that this is still being paid today. Why have meetings when no one can challenge the boss? Employees compete against each other and don't credit you for your work. There is no structured pay scale. Your pay depends on your relationship with the director and associates. There's no transparency and about as fair as buying your boss rounds in the pub. I felt sexually harassed by one of the associates who came up to me at an office party, saying how amazing I looked and that I should wear makeup every day. There are creepy relationships between the associates and some of the younger women in the office, with inappropriate behaviour and treatment. Sometimes the women quit or had to leave, but other associates always stayed. Emotionally drained when I leave work.
Well, thank you to architectural workers, wherever you are, for those initial provocations. So, our first speaker, who's presenting himself physically rather than through multimedia form, is going to be Peter Morris, who was one of the co-founders of Allford Hall, Monaghan Morris, in 1989. He's managing director, and his main focus is on the design and management of the practice itself, with a broad range of operational responsibilities. He led the competition-winning schemes for Walsall Bus Station and the Barbican Art Centre, and recently turned AHMM into an employee ownership trust, which hopefully he'll talk to us a bit about. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Ollie. Clearly, I can only talk from my own perspective, and I was 27 when we set up in practice, which means it's almost 30 years since I was last an employee and not a business owner. And as a practice, we've generally had a pretty good time and run at it, and no doubt we've been fortunate along the way. But my broad response to the question, are architects underpaid, overworked and losing their agency, is only if you let it happen. I'm here today talking about what is now a very large practice, but of course it wasn't always that way. We've moved from 4 to 400 and been all the sizes in between that. And what we know from our experience is that size is effectively irrelevant. The same principles apply to all scales and all models of practice. It's not about your size, it's about what you choose to focus on that matters and which makes a difference. We were just 4 people for our first 7 years in business. We had no clients, no private income, no friends with money, and an economy that back in 1989 was rapidly going south. And all this in the context of a prevailing mood among the general public which treated the architectural profession, and particularly modern architecture, with a high degree of suspicion, if not outright distrust. And of course, as a new practice, you have to find ways of building a reputation, which almost always involves charging too little while doing far too much. And it's hard work, but that's okay, because you've only got yourselves to worry about at that stage, and you're in it for the adventure and the opportunity, and because you hold on to an ambition. But when you're no longer just 4 and you start to employ people, be it 14, 40, 140, or even nowadays, nearly 400, you can't continue to hold on to that mindset. You have additional responsibilities, and so you have to behave differently. And the problem is that there are too many practices in the profession who don't behave differently as they start to grow. And so as a comfort blanket, we, as a profession, allow ourselves to sustain the myth that architecture is inevitably underpaid, overworked, and undervalued. Why do we do this? Well, it's because we're trained to love architecture, which is a difficult thing to do and to do it well. And we all fall into working silly hours from the off. But in my experience, it doesn't always have to be like that. And the key is how you manage your architectural ambition alongside your financial situation. Which brings me on to the only two things which really matter in the pursuit of architecture: opportunity and money. And the fact that you have to be really clear about what each project might offer, and make sure that you keep a healthy working balance between building your reputation and managing your bank balance, especially early on in your career. Because you can't make architecture, let alone a business, without money. And money you have to earn. It's equally important to say that nothing you ever do should be hidden from view. Everything should be capable of being turned into an opportunity, however modest, and so add to your reputation. And if you think it won't do that, then you simply shouldn't be doing it at all. And then, your ambition for architecture has to align with that of your client. Your architectural agenda has to be explicit and shared, not covert, or experience tells us it's not going to turn out well. And for us, this alignment of ambition goes hand in hand with a fundamental belief in our professionalism as architects, able to both design and to see constructed our buildings. But most importantly, by working with our clients in a transparent way, so that each client, which includes contractors as well, of course, possibly half of our clients are contractors, whatever the scale of opportunity, understands clearly how design is working in their interests by making architecture that is of cultural and social, as well, ultimately, of financial value. I believe it's no coincidence that our clients, both public and private, tend to hold on to their buildings for the long term. They can all see that architecture has the ability to yield value over time, which is not a bad description of what good architecture should be, yielding value to clients, to those who will use the building, and to the city. But let me be very clear in response to the topic of this debate. In case anyone has misunderstood what I'm saying, we believe in making money because it enables us to make architecture, to choose which projects to take on, to choose when to lose money and when to cross-subsidise other projects. The only way I think you can build a practice of whatever size or model is by taking yourself seriously, not just as architects, but as a professional business, and with all that that implies. But, because we're all trained to love architecture, it's all too easy to become carried away with the opportunities that come to us, at the risk of giving too much away for free, even after we've begun to establish a reputation. So we have to control these urges, or at least manage them carefully. It's been our choice as a business over recent years that two of the founders have become increasingly focused on the long-term development of the practice, as well as its stability and security as a business and employer of almost 400 people. Designing the business is a design project all of its own, and one which never ends. But making this choice has allowed the other two founders to be released to pursue the shorter-term business of designing and delivering architecture. And for us, employee ownership is the next step in this design project. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm sorry that my gong went off just as you were about to tell us about your employee ownership structure. So that'll be one of my first questions. So make money, love architecture. You make it seem so easy. So next up, we have Lucy Carmichael, who is Director of Practice at the Royal Institute of British Architects, where she leads the programme that supports effective architectural practice and professional standards. Before joining RIBA in 2013, Lucy worked in architectural practice and at the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, CABE, providing design advice on significant development projects, including London 2012 Olympics. Over to you, Lucy.
Seem to have the file path of that image on that. I hope it's not going to be all the way through. Good evening. Paul's helpfully paved the way for my arguments. But I'm going to start off by saying, imagine a world where all architects run profitable businesses, which value and engage their staff teams, offer flexible and inclusive working conditions and career progression, as well as doing rewarding, innovative, and socially valuable work. Well, we wouldn't be having this debate if that was the universal experience of practice. We all know that fees are stagnating, and some practices struggle to bring in money and pay themselves and their staff a living wage. And we also know that others have built profitable and award-winning businesses on the back of long working hours and at the expense of their staff well-being. Ollie's already mentioned the AJ 2017 Life in Practice survey, which painted a pretty bleak picture of an overworked profession with unpaid overtime the norm and having negative effects on mental well-being. Tiredness and stress are going to be the health issue of this generation. And it's not going to be long before it's socially unacceptable or even irresponsible to expect or to work long hours because they undermine productivity, increase time off, and damage long-term health. Really, it's going to be the smoking and obesity of the 2010s. But recent RIBA research, I've been forgetting to click, excuse me. Recent RIBA research into the characteristics of practice resilience showed that business-like, people-centered firms with a positive, nurturing culture are most likely to survive and thrive during the times of economic uncertainty ahead. And our 9 practice role models, who speak for themselves on these slides, are evidence that socially purposeful and client-focused approach to projects, strategic intelligence and adaptable attitude to business, and a people-centered ethos to staff well-being and development, it means it might just be possible to have it all. And maybe these 3 factors are bound together in a virtuous cycle. The real question is, are architects victims of a regulatory procurement and market system that's stacked against them that only the RIBA can deliver them from? Or are they their own worst enemies, bringing each other down through suicidal fee bids, giving ideas away for free or even buying work, putting up with unhealthy working hours and unpaid internships, focusing on design at the expense of financial planning and management, refusing to adapt their business models or change fixed ideas what they thought being an architect would be like, forgetting that without clients they have no business, or by allowing themselves to be marginalised as box dressers in a fragmented design and construction process because they shy away from the risky, the difficult, or technical. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty out there that needs to be changed, and recent events have revealed that the whole financial model of the construction industry is broken, with shareholders creaming off the top and very little profit trickling down through the supply chain. We know that contractor-led design and build procurement, incentivised through taxation, divides and rules concept and delivery architecture, and pushes architects further into extinction. And of course, short-term cost-led procurement is driving out the quality of service and outcome and the value that architects bring with it. And the RIBA are onto some of this. You know, we're arguing against mega frameworks and for proportionate quality-led fixed fee procurement. And we're even thinking about minimum viable fee competition, where clients set a lower threshold based on the actual cost of delivering a project, so they can resource their services and guarantee safety and build quality. And it also seems pretty hopeless when architects have a lower status in the planning process than conservationists or arboriculturalists. I mean, let's not hold our breath for protection of function, but requiring charter-built environment professionals to submit planning applications, certainly for any project of any scale and complexity, does seem reasonable. But maybe the time has come for architects to do a bit more to help themselves, to stop competing with each other when they should be joining forces against the managers and the specialists who are taking their territory, to stop giving it up because they aren't willing to take on the risk and liability that brings a financial reward and status, to let go of design authorship and collaborate with other practices to overcome procurement barriers, and to stop accepting unreasonable contract terms. One recent example, we found that 90 practices had agreed to no planning, no fee terms in a housing association procurement. Which cuts to the heart of the issue. Responsible financial and resource management, fair and equal treatment of staff, and socially responsible practice are the basics of ethical professionalism required by the ARB and RIBA codes. The bottom line is there's no excuse for poor employment practice. So coming back to the start, Our evidence tells us that practices who are business-focused, inclusive, adaptable and innovative are the ones who are going to survive the 21st century Darwinian race. Let's stop making excuses, blaming others, and let's take responsibility for our collective future by evolving into a professional superspecies. If architects play it right and seize the opportunities of disruption, it might be the contractors who need to fear for their futures. Most importantly, they need to value and invest in their teams. When the skills shortage comes, it will be a commercial as well as an ethical imperative. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucy. So, next up, we have Patrik Schumacher, who is principal of Zaha Hadid Architects and has led the firm since Zaha Hadid's passing in March 2016. He joined the practice in 1988 and was seminal in developing the firm to becoming a 400-strong global architecture and design brand. In 1996, he founded the Design Research Laboratory at the Architectural Association, where he continues to teach, along with writing, teaching, and lecturing around the world. Over to Patrik.
Welcome, guys. Good to see you. I'm happy to be here. Why are you laughing about capitalism? We all live it. We should better own up to it. And it has delivered a lot to all of us. My story is very similar to Peter's, actually, from 4 to 430 years. And a lot of things changed. So my values and headlines here are freedom, first of all. And we had a lot of those, and we still have that, but not enough anymore. And self-directed work, as well as self-responsibility in the name of productivity. That's what we're also responsible for, because we can imagine all sorts of fanciful and wonderful ways of working without stress, without much pressure. But productivity, I know, could go out over the roof very, very quickly or under the water if you can easily spend double the amount of time with more people and more care, and then you have a quadruple cost, and that means for all of us who also live of these productions, we have only a quarter of the wealth. So that's a problem. So we need to understand, first of all, that these are my theses still, but I'm coming in from a different angle than I used to come out when I was still a Marxist. And I recognize that capitalism is a great prosperity engine of world civilization, which really delivered that what we all have now, that we can jump onto a plane and fly to Australia and watching a number of movies and have a meal and then feel good and communicate across the world and all of that. It comes from somewhere, and the work patterns we now have, much better than they used to be, delivering that. And we need to look at it from the angle of productivity. So increase in economic productivity is very important. We have various systems, economic systems. So when we talk about social issues and moral issues, we need to talk about economics. We need to talk about political economy and socio-economic principles. And then he thought that we have another stage, but he got that wrong. So we're still moving into various stages of capitalism. And I think we need to reflect political economy and the society is purely and solely a continual series of exchanges, and they need to be organized somehow. We know that for 200 years now. And the problem of political economy is that we have to solve the coordination of everybody's economic activity so that the multitude of individual contributions add up to something, and next year more than this year. And that has certain principles, and some of them are not overlapping with ideas of best practice. And we need to buy into the price system and money, because that fantastic telecommunication and information processing system, which signals all the urgencies and scarcities around the world and brings all the individual plans under some kind of magic integrated plan, which isn't centrally planned. The bureaucracy can't substitute for this. Only in the previous era there was semblance of substituting that through central plan. And the profit and loss system is very important to realize, that it steers resources to their most valued uses. This also includes land resources and labor resources, what people are working on. And losses signal that you're wasting resources, in fact. So I'm talking about market democracy, because I think we also have to look at all the customers and consumers who are buying with their purchasing power on the basis of their rendered services. in the profit and in the market democracy system and steering resources rather than some planner and bureaucrat think what's good to be worked on. And I think Marx and Engels in particular were celebrating capitalism for some of these aspects, the continuous progress of productivity, but also cosmopolitanism and breaking through the narrow-mindedness of national boundaries, global communication, which draws all aspects into a kind of unified civilization and brings that out of this kind of rural idiocy. So they were very much aware of capitalists' progressive drive, and but they also said this: there is a kind of class structure underlying this, and they were worried about this. But where did they get their ideas from? Actually, from the liberal tradition of the French laissez-faire philosophers, which developed their own idea. First of all, they realized that the revolutions are driven by this kind of class structure where some people live of their own labor and others through other people's labor. But what they thought was, the way this worked was politically, through the state, through taxes, through royal concessions, meaning licensees, through custom duties, that was their idea of class structure. And we need to look at class theory. We look at political power, not which is real power, and economic power is power in inverted commas, because you're not backing up with force and coercive force. I think that's very important for me, that notion of economic power. I put that in question mark. So we also need to realize that technical progress is obviously the driver, and Marx knew that. And so finally that we have moved to a different era. We moved from this era of mechanical mass reproduction to this era, which had actually trade unions and workers' power and egalitarian thrust, to a post-Fordist era, which is a very, very different logic. And I just want to give you a final image to this, which has very, very different logic and different ways of working, which is much more self-directed, which includes maybe a lot of self-exploitation. And I want to end up with this image to get you this is not far. Here. And in this kind of new world, which delivers these new levels of prosperity, we can't apply the kind of ordinary left-wing recipes which Oliver has been kind of pandering, but we need to accept a much more degree of precariousness and dynamism and self-directedness and self-responsibility, I believe. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Patrik, for condensing an entire history of capitalism into 5 minutes. Now, next up, yes, we have Joe Carr, who has heroically stepped into Harriet Harris's place, who's unfortunately pulled out very ill at the moment. I had the privilege of being taught by Joe myself, actually, at the Royal College of Arts when he was Director of Critical and Historical Studies, which I think is probably what made me so critical. Joe, as well as being an eminent historian, publisher of many books and teacher, is also a London bus driver. I think 2 days a week, is that right? So if you're ever in North London on a number of routes, which he'll tell you might have the privilege of being driven by him. Over to Joe.
Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, I taught that lad once. We always knew he wouldn't come to much. Ladies and gentlemen, they always say that you should never start a public presentation with an apology. So here are my apologies. Firstly, the most obvious one, I apologise for not being Harriet Harris. And that's a sincere apology, you know. And there's something ironic, isn't there, in a debate about architecture and work, that one of the most dynamic and extraordinary women working in contemporary architectural practice and education should be replaced by a bloke in a suit. You know, I almost need to say nothing else than that, perhaps. She's someone who I think has genuinely, you know, her ill health is partly as a result of her indefatigable, can I say that? Her extraordinary workload and dedication to her profession. I have a second apology, which is I really was only called in this afternoon to do this. The reason I was called in was that I wrote an essay for a book that Harriet co-edited a few years ago called A Gendered Profession. And so my argument for my topic tonight was based on that single issue about women in architecture. I've had no time to expand it to anything else. So what the verbiage I have here, which I may not even get to once that gong, that representative of kind of patriarchal power systems, goes off. So this talk is actually, the things I have written down are framed within particularly about the arguments about women and architectural representation. But my message is a much bigger one. I'm here, I could be one of any number of people. I could have been, perhaps should have been, Robert Mull here, for instance. But he says he spoke at one of these events recently, so it's fallen to me. Because we are a group who are setting up this thing here, or trying to set up this thing here, the Union of Architectural Workers. I haven't told my colleagues, I don't think, that the acronym was my invention, because I'm a great fan of Detroit, and I'm a great fan of the American United Auto Workers Union, so I thought we'd have some extra muscle, perhaps, if we use the same acronym. But this union is about architectural work in general, not specifically, obviously, and about increasing diversity and representation, and not specifically about women. But if I just quickly start with a kind of condensed version of the proposition of my essay, and I'm just going to read this, which I very rarely do. For as long as most of us have been practicing and teaching architecture, the fundamental question remains constant. Why do so many women choose to study architecture? Approximately 50% of first-year architecture students are women, and yet so few stay working in mainstream practice in the UK. A mere 20% of architects overall are women. This exclusion and marginalisation of women from the architectural profession is a long and ignoble record. To overcome this problem, we require a brave and unapologetic strategy for change. Well, who could argue with that? I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that that is an unsatisfactory situation that cannot continue any longer. Collectively, we pretty much all recognise that there is a problem with the architectural profession when seen in that way. But given that we've wrung our hands about it for decade after decade, this issue has gone on for so long. 1898, Ethel Charles becomes an architect. 120 years. Given we've wrung our hands about it for so long, for generations on end, makes it clear that we can no longer leave it to the existing institutions and structures of the architecture industry to claim that they're sorting it out. And with a nod to Karl Marx, my nod to Karl Marx, we have to cease merely debating and interpreting this issue. The point must now be to change it. So a few thoughts. Compared to most of the other major equivalent professions, say law or medicine or teaching, where I come from, architecture lags in terms of representation and diversity, but also in terms of wages and conditions. So what have those professions got that architecture and its associated professions don't have? Well, you know the answer to that one. They're all represented by a union. Just think back a few years, just into very recent times, about the campaigns around doctors' contracts and junior doctors' hours, and think about those in the context of architecture. Contracts and hours. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So what about the existing structures? What about the RIBA? This is, I should say, not an attack on them. This is not, we're not proposing anything to replace the RIBA. The RIBA has an important and valuable role. But the RIBA is an organisation of employers, of the people at the top of the profession. It's not an organisation that is intended or designed to represent the rank and file workers in this industry. And, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Think about the name architect. You remain an architect whatever you do. So if you're at AHMM, you're an architect when you're 4 people, you're an architect when you're running a practice of 400. No other industry does that happen in. You know, if the head of a practice was on television, they would still be described as architect so-and-so. Whereas if they were at the top of the teaching profession, they would be headmaster, you know, or something equivalent. So there's this extraordinary kind of falsification, I think, in the terms architect. The architect at the top of the tree is not doing the same job and is not the same person as the person working at the lowest levels of the same industry. There we go. Patriarchal gong. This whole debate is inevitably going to be about statistics, thingy, and damn lies and all that stuff. I would just quote Julia Barfield, who observed, with more than a hint of sarcasm, from 13% to 38% in 100 years. Assuming this kind of change is exponential, it should only be about another 40 years till we get to 50-50. Do you know how many women there are on construction sites? How many women actually are on site? what proportion of workers? 1%. Do you really want to work in an industry where that happens? Because I don't really. If there'd been such a union as this, fighting for architects for as long as there have been in those other professions, it would at least have ensured the necessary and fundamental rights that all workers should enjoy. In the case of architecture in particular, that would mean that regular working hours be guaranteed without the automatic assumption that unpaid, unlimited and compulsory overtime can be imposed at will. And also that other discriminatory practices that have consistently prevented so many women from building successful and sustained careers as architects could be resisted and even eliminated from architectural practice. And of course, thank you to the AJ, whose survey published today revealed that 1 in 10 women said that they had been sexually harassed at work. That's a shocking figure, but we know the truth is probably higher than that. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in this industry, not just architects, and the reason we say architectural workers, we mean all those people involved in this broad thing called architecture. We need you. Come and join our union. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joe. I forgot to scroll down to the crucial bit, but maybe I'll leave that in the background. Can I invite the 4 panelists to join me on the daytime TV sofas, please? Now, because architectural workers couldn't be here in the flesh, they very kindly sent 4 points so we can have a kind of participatory survey with the audience. So I'm just going to begin with that briefly. The first question for architects or architectural workers amongst you, do you think you are fairly compensated for your work? Hands up if you do. Okay, very few.
Fairness is an empty, fair pay is an empty concept.
Okay, we'll come on to that in a second. Do you do over 10 hours overtime in a regular week? Okay, but yeah, most people by the looks of it. Is your overtime unpaid or unfairly compensated? Okay, that's pretty much the same number of hands. And finally, do you have agency in your day-to-day employment? Okay, well, I hope architectural workers are taking note of these statistics. I'm afraid I'm not counting myself. But you know, just from that brief survey, there's cause for concern, I would argue. And I think what didn't quite come across in some of your presentations is the reason for this situation, what the main obstacles are for us having a kind of fairer working culture where we're not quite so masochistic. Could I just ask you in turn to kind of just talk a bit more about what the key obstacles are? You think maybe pick one, the most crucial obstacle that needs to be overcome and how it could be overcome. Maybe starting at the end. Yeah, Peter. Well, to all of you.
I think I started off by saying architecture is a difficult thing to do. We're learning about it all the time. Every time we start a new project, you know, we have a new set of circumstances we're dealing with, working out how you are going to resource a project, how you're going to establish a fee for a project, all of those things you're learning from scratch almost every time, even at our advanced state of maturity. That's not an excuse, that's just an observation, I think. I think some of the obstacles to...
No, you said it earlier, we just love the work. And for me, that's a form of compensation we have to include. It's not only monetary compensation. That's why so many people crowding into this, and then you have a competitive process.
The level of enjoyment, you mean, in your labour should be taken into account and not compensation?
I think that's an important part.
I think there is good overtime, in a sense. And let me explain what I mean by that. And by that I mean that I'm enjoying what I'm doing, I'm fulfilled by what I'm doing, I'm learning by what I'm doing. And there's also bad overtime, which is I shouldn't be here because somebody hasn't resourced this properly, this programme, or actually habit sometimes. So I think there are a number of sides of this, and I think there is an element, which is why I talked about we love architecture. There is a side to this, which is that you know, we start off with that habit. I'm not saying, therefore, that there's an employ of 300 plus people, we rely on that habit, but there's no doubt that habit exists. We try very hard to manage the amount of work people have to do, But life is messy, and I don't say that as an excuse again. I say that's the real nature of making things happen, like complex things like very large or even very small architectural projects.
When you say you tried to make that happen, I mean, do you actually have anything set in place as a practice? So the two practices that are represented here, to ensure it doesn't happen, that you have to go home after a certain number of hours?
I think you would be lying if you said you could ever invent a model of architectural practice where overtime never happens. And I'm not saying that in an exploitative way. I just think it's what I talk about, the messiness, actually. This is not despite 28 years of running a practice, the magic thing where you have this model which says, as long as I do this, this, and this, and get paid this, and have these people available, and it will all work out perfectly. That is a myth. That is never going to happen.
Well, it happened. We're doing quite well. I mean, we have... it's all self-regulating and it's all enforced, but we settled into a very easy-going culture of 10 to 7. And that's the general. And then there's, of course, those people who want to do more. They're coming in. And
5 days a week or
there's occasion. Of course, there's some deadlines, and in different groups it's different. The younger guys, of course, and girls, they want to push harder maybe, and they can still take it. I mean, I was myself working until midnight every single day for years. So because I wanted to have it, I wanted to push it. I want to kick
the fundamental problem
forward, and I think that's totally okay. And I don't think we should second guess that and feel pity for them, because that's what people like and want to do. But we at the same time, it's not sustainable for everybody across ages. So
doesn't quality go down? I mean, the longer your interns stay in the office and the later nights and longer weekends,
you can maybe coach and give advice.
Unproductive.
Yeah, maybe that could happen, and then they get a bit of advice, and it's true. But at the same time, the other 5 hours, if you're young and you put them in, this just gives you more an edge.
Can I ask the RIBA what you're doing to try and regulate this, to stop unhealthy amounts of overtime, unpaid internships, all of the things we've been talking about?
The RIBA have recently... can I ask another question of the audience? Because I'd be interested to know how many people in this audience work for RIBA chartered practices? Okay, so that's a bit alarming. Because it's an RIBA chartered practice requirement to pay all staff, so anyone who's working in architecture, whether or not they're a qualified architect, the living wage. And obviously the whole kind of living wage foundation premise is based on the hours that you work, so it would include overtime. The RIBA kind of quite clear that you need to treat your staff. We have kind of all chartered practices have to sign up to an employment policy and an equality, diversity and inclusion policy, which requires them to treat their staff team fairly.
Do you think you're helping somebody with this? Because what I think is that it excludes a lot of people who have studied and maybe have disadvantaged backgrounds and therefore can't deliver the equivalent of this kind of wage, and therefore never be able to enter this profession, no matter how ambitious and willing of sacrifice there would be, self-sacrifice, self-promotion, they're excluded through these kind of limitations. So
people from disadvantaged backgrounds are the people who need the most. They're the people who need protection most.
No, but they will never get a job.
People who can't fund themselves through internships.
Internship would be the only route for them, I think.
How can you take on an internship if you can't afford a place to live, if you can't afford travel? The only people who can do internships are people who have private means, private income. And at least, okay, it's a small step, but at least requiring a living wage for anyone who works in architectural practice means that somebody can afford a basic standard of living in London.
Could I just ask the two architects what their policies on internships are in the office?
We don't have any internships, and we never have.
Okay.
So we used to have internships at the early days, which and because of these regulations and rules, we also had to cut them down. So we're doing them like a kind of a quasi-charity of sorts, because if somebody's coming for 4 weeks and being paid, or 6 and 3 months, it's obviously not
So paying your workers is charity.
Well, at
the moment, do you ever do any work for free?
A new definition here.
Oh yeah, we're doing a lot of work for free. But
so Pat, your business is built on doing work for free. Would you work for free now for the
we're doing a lot of things for free. We're doing a lot of we're doing some pro bono. We're doing we sometimes cross-subsidize projects. What I wanted to say is...
Yeah, perhaps I should butt in here.
Yeah, I think you should.
No, I'm going to finish the point. And that's why the point is obviously
finish your point
clear.
very quickly.
The fact that somebody's spending time and using resources and airtime of instruction could be that there's a net economic loss for the company.
Okay, so internships are
Even
commercially
if
inefficient,
still
so
be a
all the
loss.
more reason not to do them.
It's just something that we still do them. You know what I mean? But it has to be clear that if these rules weren't there, we would give more people a chance to appraise whether this is a route or whether they rather go to McDonald's.
Well, we have two different versions
You should
here,
get paid
don't we?
at McDonald's.
Hang on a second. Both architecture
So either flipping burgers.
we have
innovation.
both
Just let Joe say his
principles
piece.
of an architectural practice and the RIBA shouting at each other and not listening to other voices, right? That might be an indication of a problem, do we think? I repeat back to you, 1898, Ethel Charles. You know, if it's taken 130 years to get where we got, 200 years nearly of the Institute of British Architects, then the RIBA, to exist. If it's taken all that time for architectural practice to get to a position where vast swathes of our population are excluded from even entering the practice of architecture, let alone being successful in it, then there is something wrong. The existing systems are not working. And I do think, for me, a union would not solve all of the problems. It's just one particular part of a solution to a more complex situation. But wait a second.
Unions have it the wrong way around.
Unions are the one thing that's missing from the equation. We have an employers' organisation, the RIBA. It does its job. But if I was working in a factory, I wouldn't go to the CBI, I wouldn't go to the Confederation of British Industry to sort out my wages and conditions and hours. I would go to my trade union, and that's what architects and people working in architectural work need to do.
Can I ask the other three to respond to the idea of the union, and whether you would join it yourselves, and if you think it would be beneficial or not? Starting with Peter.
Do I think it would be beneficial? I see no harm in it, I think, fundamentally. I don't see why that would be a problem. I suppose we're an open plan office. We're an open dialogued office. People have conversations in our office. I know everybody in the office. I second interview 95% of staff unless I'm on holiday. So I know people's names. I know what they're doing. I know the projects they're working on. They can have a conversation with me. So in a sense, yes, you could have a union. But actually, if anybody ever felt upset about how they were paid or the hours they were working, there are many, many routes, and this has been at any scale that we've been, where they could have that conversation with somebody who's in a position to do something about it. And we have many, many processes in place to keep an eye on when people are working long hours and to try to do something about it, whether that's just to eliminate it or to offer them time off in lieu or sometimes to recompense them for that. So there are a whole host of things that we do to try and deal with those things. We do take it seriously.
Lucy, would this union be treading on RIBA's toes? Shouldn't you be doing this job?
I don't think it'd be treading on RIBA's toes. I think it would be a great shame if we got to the point where it was absolutely necessary. I think it would be an indictment on the professionalism of architectural practices and businesses. I think I'd like to see all architectural practices following the lead of the AHMMs and the practice role models, and actually being the kinds of organisations where their staff where they have transparent leadership structures and clear career progression, and the doors open for conversation, and people are properly paid. I mean, architect is the only regulated profession. We are ethical professionals, and the idea that a union is required. We're not talking about a kind of unregulated market sector. We're talking about
Really?
Yes.
Sorry, I was just adding King's Cross out there. It looked a bit unregulated and market driven, but
No,
that's just me.
I'm talking about the architectural profession is the only
Far too much
regulated profession. And we should be holding ourselves to higher ethical standards, and we shouldn't require this kind of third layer of regulation.
But if it's an indictment to have a union, does it mean that it's an indictment of teaching, of being a doctor, of being a lawyer, of being in any of those other professions that they have unions? Is that an indictment of those professions? Because I tell you what, in those professions, they're paid better than you. Women are far better represented. People who, all diversities, whether by ethnicity, race, culture, gender, are represented better and paid better. I don't think unions are an indictment for practice, and I absolutely applaud an architectural practice saying that we should have unions. That this isn't, this isn't an either or. Unions are not in conflict with existing structures, but boy, do you need them. And,
Patrick,
it may be.
what's your take on the union?
Well, unions, obviously, I believe in freedom of association, and I would never try to stop them or call for go against them. But I would not recommend efforts for unionism. I think have the whole economics upside down from the wrong end, because they're thinking from the production side. We need to think from the consumer side, from productivity side. Work happens to do something for us and for all of us and develop prosperity, and you can't impose wages and strictures on it from the top down. That never worked. And by the way, the history of unionism shows that in comparative statistics, that unionism never helped any workforce, in any place, to gain wages advantages and working condition advantage, except for very, very small craft unions that had some kind of privilege and maybe a royal license monopoly. Then they could ramp up in a small group. All history of unionism shows it was vain. And I think it's because it's fundamentally false to think that you can just push working conditions and salaries, and that means making the products we all, at the same time we're crying about housing prices. It makes no sense, because that's what we also consumers, so you can't do that. This leads to, if you extrapolate, this leads to each profession kind of manifesting its power into kind of syndicalist block, and then you kind of negotiate between these blocks. That's the idea of syndicalism. It is a non-system. It's a paradoxical system.
If we were to extrapolate from your position, the status quo is fine. Let's not change it. We don't need change. Everything
we do
is
need
fine.
change.
None of these rights are relevant.
We don't have enough freedom. We don't allow the market processes and its rationales to work themselves through. There's far too many barriers. And
so, are you happy with current procurement culture, Patrick, and the fact that practices have to work for free to bid?
I'm a radical critic of most things which are going on in terms of the capitalist system, because it's far too little capitalism at play. We hardly have capitalism anymore.
Okay. I'm very keen to open it up to the audience, but could I just ask who in the room would or is going to join this architectural union that we have on the screen behind us?
Thank you. It's very popular.
Can I just quickly propose just one idea? Is that in this year, where we've given Neve Brown posthumously, sadly now, the gold medal, where we developed a new and very, very strong interest in the architecture of the post-war period, where we're campaigning against the destruction and demolition of some of the finest buildings created in the second half of the 20th century. There was another model of architecture, wasn't there? There was a model regulated by the state. There was a model of practice working for the state, where people could enter that profession, where people had regulated hours, where wages were regulated, and they were protected by trade unions. It seemed to have worked pretty well, as far as I'm concerned. I would like something like that back again. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a pair of roving microphones, and the first hand shot up already in the corner. So we'll take that one as the first question, and this one is the second.
I think that the time he's talking about is very boring and dreary.
Time to hear from the audience.
Yeah, of course. Until they're saying something.
Please go ahead.
Hi, I was just thinking about your comparison with the doctors' strike a couple of years ago, and I was just wondering what's your opinion on how necessary architecture is, or whether and how much it's a luxury product, and how that changes your view.
That's directed at me, I guess, is it? It's an incredibly interesting question, isn't it? And of course, architects and doctors don't stack up on that particular parameter. But I don't think any of us in this room would imagine that the creation, management, and continued restoration of the built environment is not a pretty important and primal function of our society. So
I believe that too.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
But I need to think about that one. I think it's a really good question.
Is anyone on the panel going to say that it's a luxury?
I don't think it's a luxury, but I also think, other professions have been alluded to, and the fact that they may get paid more, particularly as they postgraduates entering the profession, solicitors and so on, accountants, There is perhaps a sense that certain kind of services, professional services, can only be got from certain kind of people with certain kind of letters after their name, and it's a kind of insurance policy, if you like, whether that's legal or accounting. Whereas with architecture, you could go to somebody who may not be qualified as an architect but couldn't provide architectural services. So there is something in that, I think.
The question is, what happens when the architects go on strike? And the answer is, other people will do the work.
That was an argument that's been used throughout the last 250 years of trade union organisation, of course. And it may be true in certain...
Should it remain a protected profession, do we think?
Can I say that the problem may not be with the comparison of architects and doctors, it may be a problem of comparison with the clients, mightn't it? Because medicine is still practiced in this country for the benefit of all, or so we hope and believe. Last time I looked, architecture wasn't exactly so good at doing that bit, you know.
Look, I think it's really stupid too. This kind of whining about the architects being exploited, overworked, underpaid. For me, that's all rubbish. What I believe is, I know why I chose architecture. I actually had the option of maybe doing medical and how kind of hard work this is, how kind of constrained you are, or law, and how much fun we had as an architecture student, how much fun we have, freedom and creativity. And that's why we're crowding in. And if there's more people to compete for doing some of the stuff, then the salaries come down. But I said there's other compensation bridges, and I wouldn't change. I wouldn't swap. And there's also capacities. I mean, a certain intuitive characters who can flourish within architecture, which might not be able to do the lawyer's job or the doctor's job. And maybe that's where we're crowding in there, and we shouldn't whine about it. We should own up to it and
Okay, next question.
Or move on to another place. Become a lawyer.
Are there two microphones or just one?
There's one.
Okay, so you go, and then we'll have one at the back. Mel, if you want to scurry to the back. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi. Hi, I'm Ben Channon. I work at Sale as an architect, and I also chair the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum. I just wanted to speak to Patrik very quickly. I was at a party a couple of years ago with some other architects, and I was sat around in a group of people, and I noticed a girl actually started falling asleep. And I said to her, sort of, "Are you okay? Are we really that boring?" And she said, "No, I'm really sorry, but I work for Zaha Hadid." And it's all very well. I hear you up there saying, you know, architects are having fun and they're loving it and they're doing all this because of their passion for architecture. Yeah. But looking at her, she clearly wasn't having that much fun. So I wondered if you think it's working at your practice?
I think, first of all, as I said earlier, we have very, very regular working hours for most of the time. But then again, I mean, I've done these things and you have deadlines and you just want that result. And the reward of winning a competition and that kind of killer instinct of wanting to push and be the one, that's the reward in the end. And yeah, you have a few sleepless nights. But you don't want somebody else to come in from the RIBA and kind of castigate this and prevent that and make you kind of this kind of average number it makes no sense. Why? What's the tragedy? Is that what's happened to this girl since? Is she happy, or is she kind of destroyed and demoralized, or she still had a drink with you?
I think the tragedy is that 38% of practicing architects fear their workload is affecting their mental health, which is quite a big proportion.
Mental health is one of those.
Next question at the back.
Fats.
And then we'll take one right at the back after this.
Hello? Yes. Is it not the case, is it not medically proven that as people work longer and longer hours, they become less and less efficient?
Yeah, and they should learn that.
I am a remnant from the era of Neve Brown. And I worked most of my professional life in the public sector, which was unionised, and therefore much more friendly and accommodating to the practice of women fully participating. I'll give you a quote from...
Still happens.
From Karl Marx. He said, "Land value taxation is the last opportunity for capitalism to redeem itself." And that is what we need. The vast inflation in the property market is largely due to trade in land, which is sucking communally created wealth into the hands of already obscenely rich capitalists.
Okay.
Kate McIntosh, architect of Dawson Heights and Liam Court Road. Who wants to respond to that?
Can I just make a quick point? That Peter made the point earlier, which I utterly agree with, that you don't eradicate overtime from architecture. Of course, it's part of the nature of the profession that there will be those moments. It's true of lots of other professions. We know that it happens in the medical service. We don't have those disagreements when medical staff rush in to save lives or do whatever. But the point is that, you know, it's not a kind of either or. A regulated workplace and regulated hours doesn't mean the absolute eradication of overtime. I'm a teacher. Tell me about overtime as well, you know. But these things are compatible. These things can happen in that world. But I ask women in the audience, do they think that overtime is one of the principal reasons why women do not progress to the senior levels of architectural practice and are actually forced to leave the profession at certain points in their career? Would I be wrong about that?
Another hand raising.
So we can't allow this to continue, can we? We just can't allow that to continue. We can't have a system of working that actually either excludes you from entering the profession in the first place or ensures that you neither progress nor perhaps can remain in that profession for the length of time that you choose. I think it's egregious, I have to say.
Next question.
It's not the experience we have.
Can I just respond?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting, good point. We have a lot of returning mothers to our office. Many of them are part-time, not all of them. Some of them are full-time. They make their own choices. And I think what is always incredibly impressive, many of them are also working to very specific hours in the day because of commitments at the start of the day, at the end of the day, in terms of childcare. So they have a very confined time within which to do their work, and they do their work, and they do it efficiently, and they achieve everything that they need to do in that timescale. And so do some of the fathers in our office, and indeed those who don't have children in our office. And there are many others who are not like that, and sometimes not from their own choice, and sometimes sort of out of their own choice. And I think we are very open to making as many moves as we can as a practice to enabling anybody to get it back into work, whatever their circumstances. It remains the case, though, just to echo what you said about what I said, which that there are moments in time in architectural production, let's call it, where there are intense moments where there are times needed for more work to be done. How you manage to do that, given that not everybody is able to stay beyond 6 o'clock, is the question, I think, because I think it is endemic to architecture. It's how you do that in a way which is reasonable and sustainable for the practice, ultimately, but also for the people who work for the practice.
Can I just ask briefly, does ZHA have similar policies in terms of childcare and maternity leave?
Yes, we have. We're very flexible, open, and I don't perceive a difference in progress between the sexes. It's working very well.
God help us when we lose the European Work Time Directive.
There was
that's
one,
all I can
I think,
say.
just behind you, and then right in the back.
Yeah, just wanted to ask what each panelist's definition of freedom was.
Can I answer that one? I think freedom is to choose whether you stay working in the practice or the business or the job that you have, I suppose. That would be one example of it.
Maybe a slightly more philosophical answer.
I'm sorry. That's as philosophical as I get. I'll come back to you, though.
Lucy.
Well, likewise, choice. Choice is freedom.
I'm not sure I have a philosophical answer. The point where freedom is missing, I think, in architecture is at the entry point into the architectural professions. However difficult it is to succeed as an architect, it's even more difficult for large swathes of our society to even get in the front door in the first place. And it was bad enough in my day when I could have trained to be an architect for free, whereas of course it costs you about the same price as a large-sized building to actually even train as an architect. So I suppose my definition of freedom is actually, what I perceive as a lack of freedom about the structures and procedures of architectural education and training.
Patrik.
So I think I start philosophically in terms of the human condition, freedom from the kind of strictures of a brutal and careless universe which we have to exist with as organisms. And that's the first thing, and that we do through social cooperation and productivity gains, and that we gain that freedom, which I said, where you can suddenly roam around the world and feel empowered. And that, of course, then also requires economic and entrepreneurial freedoms to continuously deliver. And I'm also into, of course, unshackling the freedoms where we have strictures on each other, where we privileged or ordered in hierarchies of instruction. And on all these counts, I think I see a lot of progress in recent decades, particularly with a degree of more self-directed work. We are no longer in this forced bureaucracy where we had to, for the sake of material freedom, prosperity, allows us to be in the big kind of central planning, structured organization of hierarchies and instruction to put us all together. Now we're much more self-directed and free to choose the collaborators, and we no longer construct people. We have to inspire them, draw them in, and convince them to participate. There's no culture of instruction and hierarchy, and that's the self-directness of it is beautiful. But it also means that somehow this idea of protecting these characters, you only protect them from themselves. And you have phrases like self-exploitation, the cognitariat, I think they're rubbish. This is a wonderful world in a way, and we should get that entrepreneurial freedom for anybody to set up and offer opportunities and platforms to invite people to cooperate the way they see fit, and not some RIBA or a government having cookie-cutter structures. Either you work together like this, or you don't.
Okay, time for the next question.
Yeah,
that makes us all poorer.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand that this level of realism, and also I understand why people are booing you too. But
booing?
That because every time it's an argument against you, it's like it's being clapped. So, but I understand what you're saying. But it's also like it's. I see both sides as being like really radical and like, is there? I mean, like maybe not everyone wants to be empowered, or not everyone wants to feel powerful, or like they don't want to work like that much, or like they just want to like be in some corner and do their designs peacefully. And like, I'm just gonna ask: is there a way to find an optimum? Because it's obvious that radicalism is not gonna give an answer.
No, you can do that, and if you accept a little bit less pay, and of course.
So it's survival of the fittest, essentially.
Not fittest, it's life choices. And when I was working midnights and the stress of delivering, and I set myself up, I have to deliver this.
But not everyone is
and
like
then
that.
I looked at the cleaners coming in, and they're doing their cleaning at late night, and how easy, and they know they're going to finish, and they could still, they were still kind of living, and had some kind of a living wage of sorts, and there's a different choice. And I think this exists, of course.
But this is not a motivation for everyone. Like, I can clearly see from people around me that people are different, and this is not a good motivation for someone who would produce better peace in a peaceful environment.
No, I think you can have very peaceful places also in architecture, I think.
In an ambitious environment.
A peaceful haven.
You just have to be happy with a more simple life.
HMM is not a peaceful haven, but I think.
I'm just going to ask one thing. Like, if there's.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I've just one. If there's a way to optimize these regulations so that it fits to everyone, it liberates everyone in a way.
But it needs to scrap the regulation.
Sorry, I'm sort of trying to pick up on some of your slightly earlier comments, I think. I mean, I think this room, right, is not a dissimilar number of people who work in the practice that I'm a part of. And what can you say about the people in this room is that they're all extremely different individuals, and they all have their strengths and their weaknesses and their interests and their enthusiasms and their lives at home and everything like that. And we as employers have to respect and respond to that in whatever ways we can. For me, that's the kind of fundamental. And I think whatever size we've been, that's always been our view of our world. We do that in the context of running an architectural business, which is a less than ideal thing. And whether there are ways of making it more ideal, whether that's the RIBA and work that they carry out, or whether it's through unions on behalf of workers, but ultimately, architecture does work and operate in a market-based system where we have to do the very best we can as architects and as people running businesses to manage the work that we do, both to be if I can use this word, proud of what we end up doing, whether that's me as an owner of a business or a part owner of a business now, or whether that's the person who's worked on the project. That's the fulfilling aspect of this. But there is a huge amount of complexity around the world of a market-driven organisation, ultimately, which is, as I've said earlier, I'll use the word again, which is messy. And it relies you to do the very best that you can in those circumstances to mitigate the messiness of it. And that is about monitoring over time. That is about meeting with people on a regular basis. That is actually, to a degree, about having a hierarchy, which means that people looking out for people looking out for people. I mean, that seems to me a theme.
I like that. Keep the debate moving, so we'll take the next question from the audience.
Yes, well, I'm really an artist, but I was interested in the talk. And I think it's a mistake if you're saying that people get into the creative fields because they want to have fun, because I guess in this room, everybody, I mean, it's a big sacrifice to be an artist or to be an architect.
Oh, you're whining, come on. I don't believe you.
But you have to, no, but it's a real sacrifice, you know? You have to fight with all your family. You work 10 to 14 hours a day. You're not going to be paid. I think if you get into the creative fields, it feels it's because you want to change society.
But
so I think that
who should pay you? Look, if you want to produce stuff for your own self-realization and fancy, don't demand somebody else to pay for that. You know, if you want somebody else to pay or support you, you should deliver something to them which they appreciate and wish to have and pay for. This is kind of this whining, I want to do my creative thing, but I want others to pay for me. This is unacceptable. It's very naive.
No, of course, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is for society. I'm saying it is for society. You were the one that was saying that people want to be architects for fun.
Reframe your question in a succinct way. No?
No, that I think that
you're saying you have a hardship by being an artist.
I think that you're undervaluing your profession if you say that people want to be an architect to have fun. That's the thing.
Okay, does anyone else on the panel want to respond to that proposition?
Self-fulfilling somehow.
I was just going to pick up on a couple of the other points. The point about choice, the point about gender equality, and the point about different people's needs or different people's responses to what they want out of their career, which is that speaking as a woman, but there's lots of other people who have responsibilities outside their working life, or maybe just things they want to do outside their working life. It should be possible to have a successful career in architecture and rise right to the very top levels, whilst working reasonable hours most of the time, being able to have a life outside work. So, I mean, there's just a sort of slight implication in what Patrik was saying, that the people who didn't want to give their mind, body and soul to the altar of architecture didn't deserve to get to the top. And I suppose I just wanted to kind of make it clear that, picking up on Joe's point, it should be possible for anyone. And as has been said, there's 300, how many people? 150 people in this room. Everyone's got lives outside work, and every single one of the people in this room should be able to have successful careers in architecture, irrespective of whether they're willing to work, 50-hour weeks.
But can I come? Who is setting this up? Who is guaranteeing this? You have to think about. You also have to produce something which people would appreciate enough to pay. That this is cozy work environment is possible. I believe that the best practice, and you might say some people are overworking, is not the best way. But I think this has to be discovered on the shop floor. This cannot be prescribed from the RBA through bureaucrats who sit and think this through. You have to, in trial and error experiment, tease it out on the shop floor. You need freedom for that, to tease out that balance and allow all sorts of career possibilities to plug themselves in, but the honor is of not somebody else gives them that space, which now burdens everybody else. They have to find a way to contribute enough so that they pay for their own way in the way they like the balance.
Joe, is there a danger that the union could stifle Patrik's
you are in the way
of freedom?
Of this. You are preventing these discovery processes.
I just want Joe to come in. Sorry.
Well, certainly, I don't think that architecture suffers from a lack of capitalism. That's a surprising proposition to me.
It does. It does.
And I still find it kind of upsetting that I hear architects and the professional organisations of architecture saying this is what we should do. You've had enough time on this one, people. You've had enough time on this. We have to change things now. One of the things that really concerns me, as someone who's taught in architecture for a long time, is that often the very brightest students either take the radical decisions. That young lad who went to work for a major architect in Rotterdam to actually leave practice altogether, or to desperately struggle with alternative modes of practice and structures of practice. Often, end up going into big practices not out of choice, but because they're kind of forced into those structures. So architecture won't develop that ambition of allowing everyone to kind of contribute to their own satisfaction and to their own ambition, and withdraw sufficient benefits without some kind of regulation and some kind of pushback. It has to happen.
Question right at the very back.
Good evening. I'm one of the few people who actually travels around and works with international practices and genuinely has an insight into how they function in their markets. I'd like to offer some perspective for the people here. There are various countries around the world who do have an imposed union structure, such as some of the Scandinavian countries. And there you have very rigidly held work practice in terms of time. And yes, these countries are held up as being models for work-life balance and so on and so forth. But these are also the countries where the principals find it hardest to make a profit. These are the countries where some of the fee levels are the highest. So there's a dichotomy between those two positions. Now, I'd offer you another perspective. You're in a city with some of the best schools, as always, where you get the best architects, you get the best schools, where you have some of the best practices in the world and the highest number of the best practices in the world. And the reason many of you are here is because you've come here either for the schools and then the practices. So there is a tension that you need to acknowledge. You're in a country where some of the best architecture is created by the architects, but you have clients who don't necessarily appreciate it. So you get on planes and you go to other countries where it is appreciated. But the architects in those countries come here to work. So the union's idealistic position that in some way by regulating the number of hours you work and how much you get paid is at loggerheads with the very reason why the people come to this country. The one thing that's missing from this debate is the accusation of the RIBA. Now, I'm an architect originally. I went to the Bartlett, and I've chosen a course where I help to negotiate fees. The bit I can't deal with is the RIBA's position on this. So I left the RIBA. That was the only protest I could make, because the RIBA doesn't support the profession properly. It has a two-faced position in competitions. It takes a fee from clients, and yet it puts up, I would suggest, for 10 competitions, one gets built. That's not a practice that occurs anywhere else. Every other country, competitions occur on the basis of there being fees in place.
Can I just ask you to wrap up your question?
No, the question is of the RIBA. The RIBA stands there and says, oh, you know, these poor architects, they're working too hard, they're doing this, that. They choose to come here because the best architects are here. You're not protecting the architectural practices.
What do you say to that?
Well, I wasn't obviously putting forward the idea of a union, although I think it's something that could work. I think it's a shame it's necessary. I just wonder why you're putting the question to me about unionisation of architecture.
You're not doing your job, essentially, is the accusation.
Oh.
As an institutional body, not you personally.
I'm not doing my job because architects want to come and work in the UK.
I mean...
But I think Robert has a point. The kind of company we've created with our reach, with our dynamism, we couldn't have it, and it doesn't exist in places like Germany and other European countries where there's more strictures and more impositions and more union-style impositions. And it couldn't exist in a few other European countries.
So unions are bringing down the German economy. That's a real shame, isn't it? Damn. Whereas the mighty, all-powerful unions in England are bringing us to the knees.
Style of firm requires degrees of freedom which are not available everywhere.
I have to say the freedom of movement is a bit of a flaky argument to use. If we think that the fact that people come to this country because we offer something extraordinarily dynamic, I try telling that to the Eastern European fruit pickers who live in my native Herefordshire. Freedom of movement is not about the kind of wonderful model we offer. It's about something else.
Not entrepreneurial freedom, business freedom.
The premise of your point, though, is you can only make great work if you exploit your staff. But you're saying that's mutually exclusive with fair employment terms?
Which also means that 70% of great architects are men, of course, doesn't it? And 99% of architects are white. Great architects, great architects.
Points from over here.
Yeah.
Okay. Please ask your question.
You're overlooking non-monetary compensation, which is a career prospect.
Patrik.
If regulation has to exist within the UK, would the panel prefer royal chartered regulation or state regulation?
Royal charter or state regulation, which is your preference, Peter?
That's not a question I've ever considered before. I mean, there was a kind of regulation which we haven't talked about, which used to exist, which was called mandatory fee scales, where all architects, and I think you might have alluded to this in the European model, where all architects could guarantee to charge a certain percentage fee for a certain type of projects. And it was very clear, there was a nice graph available to tell you exactly where you could go.
I want to comment on this.
And as a result, in theory, that would allow you to work out exactly what your workforce was to do that, how much you could pay them, how long it would take to do, and all that sort of stuff. Notionally, a kind of perfect model. But of course, the Monopolies Commission, and I think probably rightly said,
absolutely
you can't do that, right?
Yeah.
So that was a kind of regulation which maybe was could have had a benign output, but actually ended up being sidelined, and I think for the right reasons, because ultimately, we are not entitled to make a living. We have to earn our living.
Absolutely,
that's fundamentally what I think. That doesn't mean you don't have to earn a decent living. That doesn't mean you can't work decent hours and occasionally longer, because ours is not a perfect model. And anything I said earlier was not saying we've got it right. We're saying we try to get it right. And I think that's the same with architecture. It's contingent on all sorts of things.
I mean, that flashed up at the RBA, this kind of fantasy of limiting competition between architects, this fantasy that we should all become a monopoly, and then the rest of society has to suck it up, we rake it in.
Lucy, should we be
through guarantees,
reintroducing fee scales?
It's absurd.
I don't think reintroducing fee scales is likely or probably desirable. No. I think we need to rethink the way fees are calculated. I came from a very interesting discussion actually this afternoon with two of our role model practices who were completely rethinking the way fees should be calculated in relation to development economics, for example. So I do think we need to kind of fundamentally think about the way fees are calculated. I think fee scales are a thing of the past, and that's probably a good thing. In answer to your question about regulation and royal charter, well, we have both at the moment. They work alongside. That's been the current decision. Obviously, the RIBA isn't the regulatory body. I mean, our role is to set the highest professional standards and lead through best practice. We're not there to police or regulate the profession, which is my point around.
No, that's correct. I mean, I accept that, and I think the fee leadership and giving advice, certain standards, voluntary, that's useful because that's something others can plug into, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel, all of them. But there should be obviously imposed, which there used to be, also in Germany as well.
In a sense, it's not a question for me, because again, it's this confusion between architecture and architects as being this kind of homogenous, monolithic kind of body of people with the same interests and so forth. I don't, in a sense, care what happens to the top of the profession. I do know that the state needs to regulate the people who I'm concerned about, people who are simply, being paid a wage for doing work within the architectural industry.
Okay, the final question before we proceed to the bar was over there.
As an architecture student, a lot of the complaints we've heard about working sound quite similar to studying. So if the library is open 24 hours, why are we surprised at the offices? And with 25% of UK architecture students reporting mental health issues, why are we surprised that 38% do in the workplace? With tutors making jokes about sleepless nights before deadlines, does the way that we're taught to work during our training have a lot to do with the way we then move into the workplace?
Very good question. Does it all begin to go wrong in architecture school?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the points I made in my presentation was that, not taking responsibility for your well-being is going to be the kind of big health crisis of the next decade or so. And, it will be looked upon as being as irresponsible as smoking 40 Marlboro Reds a day or drinking a bottle of vodka, because not sleeping, getting stressed, have really kind of negative long-term impacts on people's health, which will have a huge cost to the economy in the long term. So, it's easy to be kind of flippant about, the all-night or whatever, but I think there's a really sort of serious side to it, which actually has kind of wider societal and economic consequences. So, yeah, the culture has to change in architecture schools first and foremost, but it will also, I think it will inevitably change because society's going to get to grips with this. It's already happening the other side of the Atlantic. All the kind of big tech companies have wised up to, the need to focus on their staff well-being and productivity, and they're not just doing it because their heart's in the right place. They're doing it because it makes commercial sense to them. They've realised that, it's reducing their kind of insurance bills and it's increasing their staff productivity, and yes, it's also creating a kind of better working environment for their staff. So things have to change.
When I first started teaching in architecture schools, I came from outside architecture culture, and there were two things that opened my eyes, made me very distressed, and I have never forgotten. One was my very first ever portfolio review, where they kept referring to the student as Stumpy, and I was a bit young and shy and didn't ask why. Turned out it's because he cut the top of his finger off the night before with a scalpel, having worked for about 48 hours without sleep, which I thought was a little bit insensitive. But the worst thing was attending my first crit at the Bartlett. I was told, you don't understand architecture till you've been to a crit. And I went in, and I just watched this bunch of preening men shouting and bullying and being aggressive towards young students who I thought were kind of vulnerable. And I thought it was an appalling model for education. It went against almost everything I believe about educational practice. Maybe things have got better. So yeah, I think a lot of the fun, the fact that the AJ survey said today that 1 in 7 women, and I'm sure you'd agree that the figure is probably higher, have reported sexual harassment in the workplace. If their first introduction to education, their first encounter is through the kind of bullying mechanism of a crit, that figure really doesn't surprise me at all.
Patrik,
but it's still dismaying.
Things going wrong in architectural education?
Well, you could also be too polite, and then the message doesn't get through, and there's nothing learned, and the students don't realize who is good, who is bad, what's acceptable, unacceptable. So there's a balance to be struck, and culture is shifting, and culture is moving, and also I think what you said about the kind of work practices where firms discover that certain levels intensity become unproductive, then capitalism delivers this, because if it's more productive, then it's worthwhile, then you don't need to regulate. So it's a discovery process. And in schools, I've been far more aggressive than I am now. Maybe it was horrible, but I have many students who work with me in the firm, across all the way from the board of directors down through all ranks, and they've gone through this. I was somebody who was a strong leader in the studio and in crits, but culture is changing. I've softened up.
Peter.
Well, starting with the student question, I want to come back to something that Lucy said. I think I said in my presentation that architecture is really difficult to do, especially to do well, and you're learning at the same time. So I think to a degree there is an inevitable thing around working very hard and working very long because you want to get things as right as you can. There's a separate question about how you're then treated when you walk into a room to talk about it, and I think there are different ways of doing that, right? So that's that one. And the one about mental health and how we look after people and whether we consider people's health in that sense within the practice, and whether that should be something that's derived by a view of the bottom line or not. Frankly, cheesy though it may sound, ultimately, I'm a human being. I've got 400 human beings working with me, and it's important that one thinks about people as having not just their career within your practice and their aspirations for their career progression, but also their life outside of that. And it would be irresponsible not to do that as well as you possibly can.
Great. Well, before I ask you to thank our panel, I just want to plug the event in 2 weeks' time, on Thursday, which is going to be on procurement. It's called Build, and we're going to be interrogating what's wrong with current means of procurement, why there's always a race to the bottom, why it's always based on architects undercutting each other's fees, many of the same topics we've been talking about tonight, but drilling even deeper. So can I ask you to thank our panel, and please join us for a drink in the bar.